Welcome to Boring Historian. Tonight, we'll be exploring canners and butchers, the stench and skill behind leather and meat. If you enjoy our videos, please comment below on what other history topics you'd like us to explore. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss one of our daily releases. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let me guide you into a time and place you'll want to sleep through but also never forget. Close your eyes. Hear the rasp of cleavers on wood, the dull, percussive crack of bone beneath the blade. Inhale the acrid tang of blood mingling with tallow, the heavy metallic scent that clings to the air in medieval marketplaces. Picture the tanning pits bubbling with oak bark brew, hides stretched taut and slick, sticky with lime and urine tools of transformation etched with sweat and grit. This isn't just labor. It's survival, and it demands a peculiar form of artistry. In every swing of the butcher's cleaver and every soak of leather in tannery vats lies centuries of tradition, necessity, and stubborn resilience. Tonight, we dive deep into that paradox. Blood and brine inside the butcher's world. The morning slaughter. Dawn in the shambles. The city stirs, but long before the baker has lit his oven or the bell tolls for matins, the butcher is already knee-deep in his trade. Down in the shambles, those narrow, blood-slicked lanes designated for meat, markets in many a medieval town. The work begins before the sun peaks above the chimneys. The name shambles itself comes from the Anglo-Saxon semel, meaning stool or bench, and it would eventually evolve to signify the chaos, filth, and gore that define these meat-stained streets. The scent here is not for the faint of stomach. An overwhelming blend of blood, offal, wet leather, and the acrid sting of iron tools left to rust in puddles of viscera. By candlelight or the faint gray of dawn, carcasses arrive in carts pulled by oxen, their sides slashed open, and their lifeblood pooling beneath wooden wheels. The butchers are ready, cleavers already sharpened on stones and hung in their belts, sleeves rolled, aprons stiff with yesterday's remnants. Their trade is old, as ancient as settlements themselves, but in this moment, it's simply about survival, keeping up with the morning demand for fresh cuts, sweetbreads, and suet before the gentry rise for breakfast. Tools clatter on worn chopping blocks. The crack of bone under steel echoes off the stone walls. There's a rhythm to it, almost a grim choreography. The apprentice handles the more menial tasks, draining blood into buckets for black pudding, awling skins to be sold to tanners, sweeping away the entrails before they pile too high. The journeyman works the joints, sectioning haunch from flank with practiced speed. The master butcher, often the stall's owner, oversees it all with a keen eye, not only for quality, but for the town officials who might find him for waste, left to rot, or meat sold past its prime. Flies gather quickly. So do dogs, children, and opportunists. Not all the meat will be sold fresh. Much of it will be salted, smoked, or pickled to endure longer. But this morning's cuts, the freshest livers, hearts, tongues, and tripe, must be gone by midday. There's no ice, no refrigeration, only the pace of commerce and the fickle favor of the weather to determine if a day's work will be profit or loss. Above all, the butcher carries a strange mixture of prestige and disgust in the social hierarchy. He feeds the town, yet he deals in blood. He handles animals, yet is not quite a farmer. He knows anatomy better than most physicians, but his fingers are stained and his stall smells of rot. This paradox, essential yet reviled, clings to the trade like the scent of raw flesh. And when the last cut has been sold and the knives wiped down, the butcher walks home, his boots heavy with grime and his apron still damp with the day's labor. The town will eat well tonight, never thinking too long on what the butcher saw, heard, or smelled before they did. Meat markets and moral boundaries. A grisly public affair. Imagine shopping in a place where the floor squishes. The air hums with flies, and every stall features a different anatomical horror show. Welcome to the medieval meat market, a public square where carnivores met their future dinners eye to eye, and children learned about anatomy, whether they wanted to or not. Markets were the epicenter of meat commerce, often crammed into already busy town centers. Butchers, banned from selling out of their homes, due to the overwhelming stench and risk of disease, were herded together into designated shambles districts. And the word shambles didn't just describe the street, it became synonymous with chaotic slaughter and mess. The floors, slick with blood, the counters, covered in flies, the gutters, choked with trimmings, grease, and bones. Sanitation was aspirational. Butchers performed their trade in full public view, sometimes even right next to stalls hawking bread or cloth. There were few secrets about what went into your meat, which sounds honest, until you realize how many animals were improperly butchered, partially decomposed, or stretched a little thin on freshness. Meat wasn't labeled with sell-by dates. It was judged by color, smell, and the ever-hopeful "it's fine if you stew it long enough" logic. Religious customs added their own layer of complexity. Fast days required no meat, a boon for fishmongers, but a blow to butchers. Jewish and Islamic dietary rules call for animals to be slaughtered in very specific ways, with the meat drained of blood. In a multicultural city, that meant different slaughter styles happening side by side, sometimes leading to friction, or in darker times, persecution. And class played no small part. Wealthier patrons expected prime cuts and the choicest joints, while the poor made do with offal, feet, and the bits euphemistically called pluck. Blood was saved for puddings, fat for candles, bones for broth. Nothing was wasted, not out of eco-consciousness, but necessity. The poorer the customer, the deeper they had to dig into the anatomy. Ethical concerns? Let's just say they weren't front and center. Animal cruelty laws were either non-existent or loosely enforced, and most townsfolk thought more about the price of mutton than the pain of the sheep. Children often worked alongside butchers, helping with minor tasks or driving animals to slaughter, forming early desensitization to death, a grim apprenticeship in the realities of survival. Despite this grimy backdrop, the butcher's stall had a weird kind of magnetism. It was loud, dynamic, and always dramatic. The clash of cleavers, the shouts of hagglers, the bellows of cattle. It was a performance of commerce, death, and necessity, staged anew each morning. And at the center of it all, the butcher stood as both craftsman and showman, equal parts skilled technician and huckster, selling not just meat, but the illusion that you didn't need to think too hard about where it came from. Bone-deep knowledge, the butcher's hidden skill set. While the medieval butcher may have looked like a brute with a cleaver, and indeed, many were built more like wrestlers than artisans. Their work demanded precision, anatomical knowledge, and years of practice. They weren't just hacking away at flesh. They were navigating a three-dimensional puzzle made of bone, sinew, fat, and muscle, often under the gaze of a cranky customer who wanted something specific but couldn't name the part. To the untrained eye, a side of beef or a whole hog might appear to be a lump of raw meat. To the butcher, it was a map. They knew exactly where to insert the knife, how to find the joint that would give with a twist, not force. A good butcher could break down a carcass quickly and cleanly, separating primal cuts from scraps, rendering fat for tallow, and preparing each part for its next destination, whether that was a noble's roasting spit or a peasant's boiling pot. Their education often began young, as apprentices to older masters who had honed their skills through decades of trial, error, and tendon injuries. Apprenticeships could last up to 7 years, during which time a boy might graduate from cleaning knives and chasing pigs to actually handling the kill. The work was grueling and rarely glamorous, but for those who stuck with it, it offered a kind of mastery over one of life's fundamental acts, turning death into sustenance. Beyond technical cutting, butchers were also expected to know animal health. A skilled butcher could spot signs of disease or spoilage by touch, smell, or color. This was partly self-protection. No one wanted to eat meat riddled with parasites or rot. But also a requirement in cities where inspectors occasionally made rounds. In theory, bad meat was destroyed or fined. In practice, some of it was just heavily salted and sold at a discount. And then there was the matter of speed. The best butchers worked fast, not only because meat spoiled quickly in the heat, but because customers were impatient and livestock didn't wait politely. The faster the work, the fresher the meat, and the more profit could be turned in a single day. In large cities, A butcher might slaughter dozens of animals daily, often by hand, with minimal tools. It was a ballet of blood, quick, brutal, and bizarrely elegant when done well. Even their tools spoke of their profession's complexity. Cleavers were just the beginning. Butchers also used bony knives, meat hooks, saws, and gutting blades, each suited to a particular task. These tools were cared for meticulously, honed to a razor's edge, and passed down from master to apprentice like heirlooms. Some even developed signature cuts, regional styles or techniques that marked their skill as clearly as a painter's brushstroke. What's easy to forget today, when meat comes shrink-wrapped and pre-portioned, is just how tactile and intimate butchery once was. A good butcher didn't just understand meat. They understood the living animal, the social rules around eating it, and the economic machinery it fed. They walked a fine line between provider and pariah, revered for their skill but often avoided outside of work for their stink and their proximity to death. To be a butcher was to know things most people chose not to, about bodies, about survival, and about just how thin the line was between the market and the morgue. Tanners and the art of the unbearable, where the story takes a wonderfully pungent turn. If the butcher was a master of meat, then the tanner was a conjurer of corpses, transforming dead animal hides into something usable, wearable, even beautiful. But don't let the romantic language fool you. This trade was defined less by leather-bound tomes and more by filth, fumes, and fermented filth. The tanning yard was a place where smells went to die, and then rise again, worse. The process began with raw hides, typically fresh from the butcher and still stinking of blood, fat, and hair. These were soaked in water to rehydrate them, then subjected to a brutal cleansing. First came the beam house phase, where hides were laid over a slanted wooden beam and scraped with curved knives to remove any remaining flesh. This was not a clean or pleasant task. Fat clung stubbornly, maggots sometimes wriggled out, and the stench could turn even a seasoned worker's stomach. It was called fleshing, but it might as well have been called traumatizing. Once scraped, the hides were soaked in a highly memorable solution, stale urine. Not metaphorical, it smells like pee, but actual buckets of aged human urine, sometimes collected from the local inns and generously donated by morning drinkers. Urine acted as a mild alkali, loosening hair follicles and helping the skin absorb other chemicals later on. To be a tanner was to wade ankle deep in the town's liquid history while breathing through your mouth and pretending you had no olfactory system. And still, the nightmare wasn't over. After the urine bath, the hides were limed, soaked in a calcium hydroxide solution, often made from crushed limestone or wood ash. This was stronger than urine and helped further loosen hair and tissue. The hides would then be scraped again to remove the hair. One imagines this moment as a sort of grim barbering session, except the clients are dead and smell like death itself. Now came the step that truly separated casual hobbyists from hardened professionals, the tanning pit. This was where hides were immersed for weeks, sometimes months, in vats of tanner-rich liquids. And where did medieval tanners get their tannins? From oak bark, yes, but also from dog poop. Specifically, a material called pure or pure, which referred to fermented canine feces. It was rich in enzymes that softened leather, and tanners gathered it eagerly, sometimes paying children to collect it from alleys and back streets. Imagine, it's a hot summer day. You're knee-deep in decomposing hides, stirring them with a long wooden pole through a mixture of tannic acid and poop stew. You've been doing this for 10 hours. You go home, reeking of ammonia and rot. Your neighbors cross the street when they see you coming. You are a tanner, and no one wants to sit next to you at church. Yet, incredibly, all of this labor yielded a product so valuable that entire economies depended on it. Leather was essential for shoes, belts, bags, saddles, book covers, armor, tools. A single tannery could keep an entire town equipped and export goods far beyond. The tanner was despised for his smell, but needed for his skill. It was a profession that offered steady work and grim security. As long as animals were butchered, there would be hides. And as long as people needed shoes, there would be tanners. Some towns forced tanners to work outside the city limits due to the overpowering stench. Others created tannery districts where the runoff from the vats turned local rivers a sickly brown and killed every fish within miles. Environmental awareness was, understandably, not high on the list of priorities. Still, there was an odd artistry to the craft. Master tanners could create supple, dyed leathers that fetched high prices at market. Some developed secret recipes for tanning solutions, passing them down like family heirlooms. And despite the filth, despite the smells, some tanners took pride in their work. Their product was durable, practical, and deeply intertwined with everyday life. Tanning was an act of resurrection in its way, taking the skin of a dead animal and giving it new purpose. It just happened to involve more poop than poetry. How the trades marked town identity. In the grand gallery of memory, few things lodged themselves more deeply than a smell. The reek of a tanning yard or butcher's row was not just a passing nuisance to medieval nostrils. It was part of a place's character. Its signature in the world. Towns weren't only known for their cathedrals or market squares, but by the fetid perfume that wafted over their rooftops and clung to their clothes. Many settlements bore unofficial nicknames due to their distinctive smells. A village thick with tanneries might be referred to simply as Skin Town, while neighborhoods near abattoirs were dubbed Street or Stink Alley, not by bureaucrats or map makers, but by locals and travelers alike. These names weren't meant to be cruel. They were descriptors as clear and unflinching as the trades themselves. This olfactory branding wasn't without economic consequence. Merchants, innkeepers, and townsfolk were painfully aware of what a bad smell could do to business. In some cities, they even tried to mask the pungency of butcher's offal or tanning lime with smoke from herbal fires or by burning sweet-smelling woods. Others leaned into the identity, advertising the quality of their hides or meats as a kind of rugged authenticity. Yes, it stinks, but it's fresh. Visitors would often comment in their travel journals on the overwhelming stench of certain quarters, comparing them to open graves, battlefields, or worse. One 17th century traveler passing through a bustling leather hub in France noted, "The air is so foul it sears the nose, yet the people speak of it with pride, as if the perfume were the scent of corn." But reality was this: in a world before refrigeration and sewers, olfactory offense was a side effect of survival. And for many, it was more than that. It was a badge of labor, an emblem of the working class who gutted animals, flayed skins, and stirred cauldrons of urine and ash so that others might walk clothed and fed. Even in the countryside, the scent of a tannery or slaughter shed could carry for miles. Farmers might grumble when the wind shifted, but they too relied on these places for boots, for bridles, for salted meat in winter. The smell was part of a barter system, an unspoken agreement between town and field. We'll put up with the stink if you keep our shoes from rotting and our bellies full. Over time, these trades shaped the social maps of towns just as much as their physical layouts. Affluent districts were often uphill or upwind, while tanners and butchers were pushed to the outskirts, forming semi-permanent industrial ghettos. And yet, despite this marginalization, they remained economically central. The stink, in a way, became a signpost of importance. Today, few of these smells linger. Regulations, modern sewage systems, and the rise of industrial processing plants have scrubbed our urban noses clean. But traces remain in street names, in old buildings still stained with tannin or blood, and in the deep cultural memory of laboring hands and the long wafting shadow of their toil. The odor is gone, but the legacy clings, like rawhide left too long in the sun, like meat hung too long on a hook, like stories waiting patiently to be remembered. The tanner's yard, where hides became leather, from slaughter to soak, a day in a tanner's life. The tanner's yard, by any historical account or olfactory standard, was not a place one stumbled into by accident. It announced itself long before it could be seen, a fetid miasma wafting over walls, downwind of anything respectable. Nestled on the fringes of towns and villages, Tanneries were as essential to daily life as they were deliberately quarantined from it. In an age before synthetic materials, leather was indispensable for shoes, belts, book bindings, saddles, buckets, and armor. And before all of those things could be fashioned, someone had to live in the muck and stench of dead things, turning rot into something useful. A day in the life of a tanner began earlier than the sun in many cases. The night air was cooler, and with fewer noses about. The worst of the smells could be managed. Maybe a tanner would arrive to a yard already steeped in decay and readiness. There were soaking pits, dug into the earth and brimming with foul mixtures, large wooden vats lined up like open graves for hides. Buckets of lime and mystery slop stood nearby. The air was always damp. The ground always slippery. The boots always regrettable. First, there were hides, fresh ones. Still warm, if taken straight from the nearby slaughterhouse. They came from cows, goats, sheep, deer, whatever local livestock had met its end. Beast skins were heavy, bloody, and stubborn, the flesh still clinging. The tanner's job began with scraping, a coarse physical labor. Using curved knives and dull metal scrapers, the flesh and fat had to be removed from the underside. This wasn't delicate work. It required pressure, rhythm, and no small amount of grim resolve. The goal wasn't cleanliness but consistency. Enough flesh gone to let the soaking agents penetrate, but not so much the hide thinned or tore. Next came the lime pits. These were deep vats filled with a pungent, chalky slurry made from quicklime and water, caustic enough to burn skin and dissolve hair. The hides were lowered in and left to stew. This process loosened the hair, toughened the surface, and further ate away at remaining tissue. But it also released a bouquet of smells, alkaline, chemical, and distinctly corpse-adjacent. Tanners who didn't wear gloves often bore white, cracked hands, the skin flaking from prolonged exposure. Those who inhaled the vapors regularly might cough and wheeze in the corners of caverns come evening, or find their sense of smell permanently impaired, though many considered that a blessing in disguise. Pulling hides from the lime pits was a job of timing and touch. Too short, and the hair clung stubbornly. Too long, and the hide might degrade. Once lifted out with poles and hooks, they were propped up on wooden beams and scraped again, this time to dehair the surface. The process was messy and maddening. Hair floated in puddles, caught in sleeves, clung to wet skin. Every step was a reminder. Leather was not born, it was forged. By labor, by putrefaction, and by patience. Beyond the lime pits lay the dung vats, but those came later. For now, the tanner would repeat the motions day after day, hide after hide. The stink clung to him like a second skin. Townspeople crossed the street when he passed. Children whispered. Some believed tanners were unclean, not just in body, but in soul, too familiar with rot, too cavalier with death. It was common for tanners to live near their work, often at the edge of the river, where runoff could be washed away and the cries of neighbors were harder to hear. But in their grim routine, tanners carried out a craft both ancient and invaluable. They transformed what others threw away, refuse, offal, and gore, into tools of civilization. Without them, cities could not march, ride, read, or store. Their yards were not temples of beauty, but engines of transformation. And so the tanner toiled, ankle deep in grime, skin flecked with lime, beneath skies that offered no relief. A day in his life was a study in endurance, and the refusal to look away from life's messiest transitions. Where others saw death and waste, he saw potential, stinking, steaming, glorious potential. Urine, brains, and dog dung, the secret ingredients of leather. In the alchemical shadows of the tannery yard, far from the perfumed halls of nobility or the swept floors of a town merchant's shop, the business of making leather took on a character that could only be described as odorous. This wasn't just hard work, it was profoundly biological, a gritty partnership with nature's more pungent offerings. And at the heart of it all were ingredients most would rather not think about, especially not while lacing up. Their boots or strapping on a belt. To make leather soft, pliable, and durable, hides needed more than just scraping and soaking. They required a strange brew of materials that would cause most modern noses to wrinkle and retreat. Chief among these curious substances was human urine. Yes, fresh, fermented, and freely collected. Tanners weren't shy about sourcing it either. In many towns, people were paid a small fee to bring their chamber pot contributions to the tannery. Public receptacles were placed outside homes for ease. What seemed like waste to most was gold to a tanner. Rich in ammonia, urine helped break down the fats and proteins still clinging to the hides. It served as a primitive but effective detergent, softening the hide and preparing it for deeper chemical transformation. But urine alone wasn't enough. Once sufficiently soaked, the hides were transferred to another potent solution, this one made from animal brains. The brains, especially those of cattle or pigs, contained emulsifying agents, lecithin and natural enzymes, that helped bind fats and oils to the hide. This softened the material and helped preserve its flexibility, preventing it from becoming stiff or cracking as it dried. In small tanneries, brain matter was ground, boiled, and mixed with water to create a slippery, gloppy mash. Tanners would knead this mixture into the hide with bare hands or crude wooden paddles. The result was a skin that, while still pungent, was now better prepared to survive the hardware of boots, belts, saddles, and sheaths. And if that weren't enough to unsettle your stomach, allow us to introduce the third musketeer in this noxious triumvirate, dog dung. Collected from the streets and alleys, often with help from eager neighborhood boys paid a small sum per bucket. It was used in the final dehairing and softening process. The enzymes in dog feces helped loosen any remaining hair and broke down connective tissue fibers, making the hide easier to work. Tanners would soak the hides in this mixture and, in some especially odorous facilities, stomp them by foot to ensure full penetration. This wasn't for the squeamish. One wrong step, and you weren't just ruining your shoes, you were becoming one with the process. The smells, as you can imagine, were unforgettable. They didn't just cling to the tannery, they clung to the tanners themselves. Their clothes, their hair, even their homes carried the stench. In many towns, tanneries were located at the far edges of the settlement, often downstream or downwind, and for good reason. Complaints from neighbors were common. It was an open secret that you could smell a tanner before you saw one. And yet, in this slurry of bodily fluids and organic decay, a vital trade thrived. Leather was essential for armor, shoes, saddles, bags, belts, book bindings, water skins, and even primitive plumbing. Without these ingredients, urine, brains, dung civilization would have been markedly less equipped. The tanner, though working in filth, played a role as important as any blacksmith or baker. It was a profession where one's tools weren't always metal or wood, but microbial, enzymatic, and deeply tied to the natural cycles of decay and renewal. A place where transformation was measured not only in product, but in smell. To be a tanner was to live close to nature's rawest elements and to make something lasting from its most fleeting materials. Tools of the trade, scrapers, stones, and strong stomachs. Buckle up, it's gonna get gritty and hands-on. The daily life of a tanner was as much about brute muscle and stomach steel as it was about skill. Leather didn't shape itself, and the tools that transformed raw hides into supple material were simple, rugged, and often brutal. A tanner's workshop was less a clean factory and more a madman's toolkit laid out beside rivers of filth. First up, the scrapers. These were the unsung heroes of the operation, sharp, curved blades carved from iron or bone, designed to peel away flesh, fat, and hair without gouging the precious hide beneath. The scraper's edge had to be razor sharp, but with just enough give to glide over uneven surfaces. Tanners spent hours scraping hides, their arms raw, hands calloused and bleeding, working methodically to prepare the skin for the next stage. It was a painstaking art. Too hard and you'd ruin the leather. Too soft and remnants of flesh would rot and smell, spoiling the whole batch. Next, the tanning stones, smooth river rocks, or specially carved weights used to press hides flat during soaking or drying. These stones also served as gentle beaters, helping soften the hide by rhythmically pounding it. Picture a primitive percussion instrument for leather. This repetitive beating helped break down tough fibers, allowing the chemical ingredients to penetrate deeper. The work was noisy and relentless, echoing through the tannery yard. Then there were the wooden paddles and tubs, often carved by the tanners themselves, lined with pitch or tar to withstand the constant assault of moisture and chemicals. These vessels held the caustic, pungent mixtures of urine and dung that soaked the hides for days. The paddles were used to stir the tanning baths and knead the hides to ensure every fiber absorbed the magical mixture. But tools alone wouldn't make a tanner. It took a strong stomach and a particular kind of toughness to survive the daily assault on the senses. Tanners learned to live with the stench. It seeped into their skin, their clothes, their very being. Some carried no shame, proudly wearing the scent as a badge of honor, proof of their indispensable craft. Others kept a vial of perfume or herbs tucked away, a small rebellion against the overwhelming smell. Safety was another matter. The constant exposure to chemicals and decomposing organic matter led to infections, skin diseases, and respiratory problems. Protective gloves were rare luxuries, and cuts or scrapes were often left to fend for themselves, opening the door to nasty infections. Despite the hardships, these tools and the resilience of the tanner formed the backbone of an ancient craft. Without scrapers, stones, paddles, and an iron gut, the leather that clothed armies, built towns, and protected lives would never have existed. The role of nature, weather, water, and bark tannin. Nature wasn't just background. It was the silent partner in the brutal dance of tanning. The tanner's yard was a battlefield where nature's raw elements were harnessed, exploited, and often fought against. The weather, water, and the earth itself all played pivotal roles in transforming stiff, smelly hides into pliable leather fit for use. First, the water. Clean, fresh water was gold. Actually, it was more than gold because tanning required loads of it. Hides were soaked repeatedly to wash away blood, dirt, and unwanted residues before being steeped in canning agents. Rivers or wells near tanneries weren't just conveniences. They were lifelines. Water quality mattered immensely. Mineral content, temperature, and even the speed of flow could impact the process. Too cold, and soaking times dragged on painfully. Too warm, and the hides risked rotting. Some tanners became amateur hydrologists, timing their batches to seasonal changes or even shifts in the weather. Speaking of weather, the climate was another factor tanners had to respect. Humidity influenced drying times and how the hides absorbed tannins. In damp climates, hides took longer to cure and were more prone to mold and mildew. Conversely, arid weather risked drying them too fast, causing cracking and brittleness. Tanneries were often located in transitional zones, close enough to water, but with a climate that balanced moisture and dryness. Seasonal shifts dictated the rhythm of work. Spring rains might flood yards and slow production, while dry summers sped up curing but added new challenges. Then there's the star player of the tanning process, bark tannin. Tannins are a class of naturally occurring polyphenols found in tree bark, especially oak, chestnut, and hemlock. They are the chemical agents responsible for turning raw hides into leather by binding to the collagen proteins, stabilizing them, and making the material resistant to decomposition and water damage. Gathering bark was a labor-intensive, almost seasonal activity. Tanners or their suppliers stripped bark from carefully chosen trees, sometimes peeling large sheets off felled trunks or harvesting smaller twigs and branches. The bark was then dried and ground into a coarse powder or soaked whole in large vats to release the tannins into the water. This extraction wasn't an exact science. The potency of the tannin bath could vary wildly depending on the tree species, age, and even the soil it grew in. Experienced tanners developed a near-magical intuition, judging the color, smell, and texture of the bath to decide when hides had soaked long enough. Nature's bounty was a double-edged sword. While bark tannins were invaluable, over-harvesting could devastate local woodlands, leading to deforestation in some tanning hotspots. This environmental impact was an early warning of the delicate balance between human industry and the natural world. In short, tanners didn't just work with nature, they depended on it. Weather dictated timing, water quality affected curing, and bark tannin provided the essential chemistry. Without this triple alliance, the ancient craft of tanning would have been impossible. And the very fabric of medieval society, its clothing, armor, and shoes would have suffered. The finished product, soft leather, brutal labor, where all the filthy, back-breaking work finally results in something durable, useful, and surprisingly soft. After days, sometimes weeks, of soaking, scraping, tanning, and drying, the rawhides began their transformation into leather, a material that was simultaneously tough and flexible, ready to be shaped into everything from sturdy shoes to armor. But don't let the finished product's smoothness fool you. Behind every piece of leather lay brutal labor that tested even the toughest workers. Tanneries were not just smelly, they were downright grueling workplaces. The constant exposure to chemicals, urine, lime, tannin baths could cause painful skin conditions, respiratory issues, and even long-term health problems. The workers' hands, forever chapped and cracked, were a testament to the relentless physical toll. To soften the leather, tanners had to repeatedly work the hides by hand or foot, stretching and kneading the material to break down stiffness. This process, known as staking, required muscle and patience. Specialized tools, wooden mallets, paddles, and knives were wielded skillfully to trim and shape the leather. The final texture varied depending on the intended use. Thick, rigid leather was reserved for heavy-duty applications, like saddles, belts, or armor, while thinner, more supple varieties were crafted into gloves, book covers, or fine shoes. Tanners often added oils or waxes to enhance durability and water resistance, further enriching the leather's character. Finished leather was a prized commodity and a sign of status. It clothed the rich and protected the working class. It was everywhere, wrapping wares, covering horse tack, even lining coffins. Its importance to medieval life was immense, yet its production remained one of the most unpleasant trades imaginable. The skill required to produce high-quality leather was considerable. Tanners' apprentices trained for years, learning the secret recipes and techniques passed down through generations. A single mistake, a mistimed soak, too much lime, an undercured hide could ruin an entire batch, wasting precious resources. Despite the harshness, tanners held an essential place in their communities. They were craftsmen and stewards of a complex, natural process that turned death into life-transforming animal remains into materials that shaped society's fabric. In the end, the story of leather is one of transformation, not just of hides, but of nature, labor, and skill converging to create something enduring. It's a tale of grit and grime, of smells and skill, of a trade both reviled and revered. From pasture to plate, the butcher's daily routine, jumping straight into the messy hustle of medieval butchers keeping entire communities fed. The day began before dawn, long before the market buzzed with life. Butchers rose in the cold dark, ready to wrestle with the grim realities of their trade. The journey from pasture to plate was a brutal dance of skill, strength, and precision. First came the arrival of livestock cattle, sheep, pigs, and sometimes even goats herded from nearby farms or traded from distant villages. The animals were the backbone of medieval diets. But the butcher's job was to turn raw life into edible portions with as little waste as possible. With sharpened blades glinting in the early light, the butcher started by securing the animal. The slaughter was a careful, swift act, part necessity, part ritual intended to minimize suffering, but also ensure the quality of the meat. The tools were basic, but effective. Large knives, cleavers, hooks, and sometimes saws. Once the animal was dispatched, the real work began. Skinning, gutting, and quartering the carcass required practiced hands. The butcher's expertise in anatomy was crucial to efficiently separate prime cuts from bones, tendons, and precision meant more than economy. It meant providing the community with reliable, safe nourishment. The smell was pungent, a blend of blood, sweat, and animal musk, mingling with straw and earth from the yard. Every movement echoed the relentless rhythm of a trade that was as exhausting as it was essential. Throughout the morning, butchers labored alongside apprentices and assistants, all aware that their work would feed families, traders, and travelers. The butcher's shop was a cornerstone of town life, a place where sustenance met skill. And as the sun climbed higher, the marketplace came alive. The butcher's work wasn't done yet. It was time to display the fruits of the morning's labor, drawing customers with the promise of fresh meat and honest prices. The butcher's day was one of grime and grind, yet beneath it lay an undeniable craftsmanship that sustained life itself. Anatomy lessons, knowing what to cut, and where diving into the butcher's essential knowledge of flesh and bone that turned raw carcasses into prized cuts. Medieval butchers weren't just muscle and knives. They were walking anatomy lessons, deeply versed in the secrets of animal bodies. This knowledge was crucial, knowing precisely where to slice meant the difference between prime cuts that sold well and wasted meat that could rot or be relegated to the dogs. Anatomy was their map. Each animal presented a complex puzzle of muscles, tendons, bones, and fat layers that demanded exact understanding. The hindquarters provided the coveted haunches and sirloins, prized for roasting or stewing. The ribs and shoulders offered a mix of tender and tougher cuts suited for boiling or curing. Butchers learned these distinctions early, often apprenticed under seasoned masters who drilled them in the science and art of cutting. This was hands-on education, feeling the muscle fibers, listening for the right snap of bone under the cleaver, and smelling freshness or spoilage in the flesh. Knowing the anatomy also helped butchers avoid dangerous cuts that could taint meat or injure themselves. For instance, removing the thick membrane around organs or the sinewy bits required care and precision. This expertise also guided the division of meat for different customers. Wealthier patrons sought prime roasts and fillets, while common folk might receive tougher cuts better suited to slow cooking. Butchers balanced fairness and economics, ensuring the entire animal was used, maximizing profits while serving community needs. Beyond the practical, the butcher's anatomical knowledge bordered on the medicinal. Understanding the health of animals, spotting disease or parasites during dissection, was vital to preventing outbreaks of illness. Thus, the butcher was a guardian of both sustenance and safety, wielding blade and knowledge to transform the raw into the ready. Offal and odd bits, nothing went to waste. Exploring the gritty reality that in medieval butchery, every part of the animal had a purpose, no matter how foul or forgotten. Medieval butchers operated in a world where waste was a luxury no one could afford. Every scrap, every questionable organ, and every gnarly bit had its place in the economy of survival. Offal, the internal organs like liver, heart, kidneys, and intestines, was often viewed with disgust by the untrained. But to butchers and many consumers, it was a treasure trove of nutrition and flavor. The rich and poor alike found ways to consume these odd bits. The wealthy might enjoy delicacies like liver pate or roasted sweetbreads, while common folk made hearty stews from tripe and other tougher offal parts. These ingredients added protein and richness to diets otherwise thin on variety. But the use of offal wasn't limited to food. Tanners prized certain organs for their chemical properties useful in tanning hides. Intestines were cleaned and repurposed into sausage casings or string for instruments and tools. Fat was rendered into tallow, fueling lamps and candles in homes and workshops. Even the inedible scraps found life beyond the butcher's block. Bones were boiled down to make glue or ground into bone meal for fertilizer. Hooves were processed into gelatinous substances, and blood was sometimes mixed into black puddings or used in folk medicines. This zero-waste approach was born out of necessity, but became woven into the cultural fabric of medieval life. Butchers worked under the constant pressure of this balance, ensuring that every part of the animal generated value, whether on the table, in the craft, or in the market. However, dealing with these parts also meant confronting intense odors and health risks. Handling offal demanded both courage, and care diseases could lurk in spoiled or contaminated bits, making the butcher's job not just tough but dangerous. Thus, behind every shiny slab of meat lay a hidden story of grit, resourcefulness, and the unglamorous truth of medieval survival. Marketplace theater. Public slaughter and civic order. Diving into the raw. Chaotic and surprisingly regulated spectacle of butchery in medieval towns. The butcher's trade wasn't confined to the quiet interior of a shop. Much of it unfolded in public view, turning marketplaces into stages where life, death, and commerce intersected with striking intensity. Public slaughter was a routine yet dramatic affair, governed by laws, guilds, and town officials determined to keep order amid the messy business. In bustling town squares or designated slaughterhouses at the edge of settlements, butchers gathered early in the morning, their tools gleaming and their assistants ready. Livestock oxen, big sheep were driven into pens, their loud bawling mingling with the chatter of merchants and townsfolk. The act of slaughter itself was part necessity, part ritual. Precision mattered. A swift, humane kill preserved the quality of meat, while careless cuts could spoil the product and endanger buyers. Experienced butchers wielded their cleavers and knives with practiced skill, their motions quick but deliberate, almost like a grim choreography. Yet the scene was far from clinical. Blood spilled onto cobblestones, attracting flies and casting a vivid reminder of mortality. The air was thick with the mingling sense of fresh meat, animal musk, and the faint tang of iron. Shoppers, tradespeople, and onlookers jostled for space, negotiating prices or simply absorbing the atmosphere of survival in exchange. The marketplace became a theater not only of commerce, but of social order. Butchers stood at the nexus of food supply and community trust, their reputation hanging on honesty, skill, and cleanliness, a tall order in a world where disease was a constant threat. For townsfolk, witnessing the slaughter was a brutal reminder of life's fragility and the hard work behind every meal. It reinforced the interdependence of roles, farmers raising beasts, butchers processing them, and consumers placing their faith in the system that kept their tables supplied. In this gritty dance of life and death, medieval marketplaces were much more than centers of trade. They were arenas, where the raw realities of survival played out daily under the watchful eyes of a community bound by necessity and tradition. Butcher shops and guilds, respect, regulation, and rivalries, wrapping up with the social and organizational web that kept medieval butchery in check. Butcher shops in medieval towns were more than mere stalls. They were institutions that anchored community life, wielding both practical and social power. Behind their wooden counters and bloodstained aprons lay a tightly knit world ruled by guilds, customs, and a code of honor that shaped everything from meat quality to local politics. Guilds acted as both trade unions and regulatory bodies, demanding rigorous standards to protect customers and preserve the livelihood of their members. Joining a guild was no easy feat. It required years of apprenticeship, mastery of skills, and a reputation for honesty. This exclusivity ensured that butcher shops maintained a level of expertise and trust that customers relied on for their survival. These guilds controlled who could sell meat, how prices were set, and even when slaughtering could occur. By regulating the trade, they staved off fraud, poor hygiene, and unfair competition, which were common risks in a world without refrigeration or modern health inspections. However, guild politics could be cutthroat. Rivalry simmered between shops, fueled by competition for the best livestock suppliers and prime marketplace spots. Accusations of cutting corners or selling spoiled meat sometimes led to public disputes or official investigations. Respect in the butcher's trade was as much about skill as it was about reputation. A butcher's word was their bond, and breaches of trust could mean losing one's place in the guild or facing fines and public shaming. The Butcher Guild also played a role in town governance. Often, members served on councils or contributed to civic events, blending their trade interests with community leadership. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and even emergency responses saw butchers stepping beyond the shop to support the social fabric. At the same time, these guilds fostered camaraderie and mutual support among butchers. Apprenticeships created bonds that lasted lifetimes, passing down not only skills but stories, rituals, and a shared identity steeped in the visceral realities of their trade. In the end, The medieval butcher's world was a complex balance of brutality and brotherhood, commerce and community. Through their guilds and shops, these craftsmen carved out a vital place in history, one where the stench and skill behind leather and meat told a story of resilience, regulation, and respect. Zoning before zoning. Why tanneries were always downwind. Diving into the urban and social geography of medieval tanning. In the pre-modern world, there were no city planners or zoning laws as we know them today. But medieval towns and cities still understood the wisdom of putting certain businesses where their unpleasant effects wouldn't ruin daily life. Tanneries, those infamous sources of unholy smells, were always located on the outskirts or downwind from the bustling marketplaces and residential quarters. This early zoning was less about bureaucracy and more about survival. The reason was simple but brutal. Tanning was a smelly, messy, and notoriously foul business. The stench of rotting hides, urine, and chemical treatments was enough to clear a street faster than any angry mob. Locals knew the pungent cloud that rose from the tannery would drift with the wind. So the spot chosen was almost always where the stench would travel away from the town center. By placing these operations near rivers or streams, towns tried to flush away the sludge and waste. But those same waterways became victims, turning into foaming, foul-smelling channels that carried the byproducts of leather making far beyond the tannery gates. Despite this, no amount of careful sighting could fully contain the smell or the pollution. The neighborhoods near the tanneries earned a reputation as no-go zones for the delicate-nosed, and anyone living there accepted the pungent aroma as part of daily life. Children played among the vats of soaking hides, and workers braved the stink for a paycheck few others dared to seek. This rough form of medieval urban planning revealed an uneasy but practical compromise. The town needed leather for shoes, belts, and armor, but no one wanted to live near the smelly source. Tanneries existed in the shadows, both geographically and socially, a necessary evil tolerated but never embraced. Tannery rivers, sludge, foam, and foul streams diving deep into how medieval tanning turned waterways into toxic, stinky messes. Water was the lifeblood of medieval towns, vital for drinking, cooking, and cleaning, but it also became the unwitting victim of the tanning trade's foul byproducts. Tanneries were deliberately set up next to rivers or streams, not just for water access, but because these flowing bodies could carry away the disgusting sludge from the hides. What the townsfolk didn't realize, or perhaps were powerless to stop, was how drastically these waterways suffered. The tanning process involved soaking animal hides in vats, filled with a mix of urine, lime, and other chemicals to loosen hair and fat. The leftover liquid, called tan liquor, was a toxic cocktail of organic waste and chemicals. When dumped into nearby streams, it churned the water into a frothy, bubbling mess, thick with scum and foam. The water would turn dark and murky, smelling so foul it could knock a grown man off his feet. The rivers and streams near tanneries became infamous for their stench and pollution. Fish populations dwindled or vanished altogether, leaving a silent, lifeless current behind. Locals learned to avoid the water, especially downstream, where the sludge made it unfit for washing or drinking. Clothes rinsed there smelled worse than before, and wells nearby could become contaminated, spreading sickness in their wake. Despite these dangers, the tanning trade pressed on because leather was indispensable for shoes, harnesses, armor, and countless everyday goods. Town officials often turned a blind eye, prioritizing economic necessity over environmental health. The mess was hidden away, out of sight but never out of mind, a constant reminder of the trade's brutal cost. The rivers told their own grim tale, a liquid testimony to the grim reality beneath the town's surface, one where survival meant accepting the smell. Sludge and silent poison flowing through the veins of medieval life. The social stigma of the smelly professions peeling back. The layers of how tanners and butchers were seen as the unwanted outcasts, despite their essential work. In medieval society, professions came with social rankings, just like people did, and the trades that dealt with death, dirt, and stink were often cast to the margins. Tanners and butchers, despite their crucial role in keeping towns supplied with leather and meat, lived under a heavy cloud of stigma. Their jobs were considered dirty, dangerous, and spiritually tainted, relegating them to the fringes both literally and socially. This stigma was rooted in a mix of practical concerns and deeply ingrained cultural beliefs. Handling dead animals, whether their skins or their flesh, was seen as unclean, not only because of the smell, but because death itself carried religious and superstitious connotations. The butchers and tanners, who were constantly surrounded by decay and blood, were thought to risk contamination of their bodies and souls. Many tanners and butchers lived in separate quarters or villages, often downwind from the main population to keep the overwhelming odors at bay. These smelly neighborhoods were a physical manifestation of their social exclusion, where community life was often rougher and opportunities for social advancement were scarce. Guilds offered some protection and a sense of identity, but even these organizations couldn't fully erase the shadow of suspicion and disdain. People whispered about the foul trades, associating them with moral laxity or even dark magic. The professions attracted their own myths and superstitions. Tanners were sometimes thought to consort with witches or spirits because of their strange smells and secretive vats. Yet, despite all this, these workers formed tight-knit communities, relying on each other for support and pride in their craftsmanship. Their skills were passed down through generations, and their leather and meat fed and clothed the population. Even if polite society preferred not to acknowledge their vital contributions openly. The story of the smelly professions is one of resilience in the face of exclusion, a testament to the human capacity to endure and find dignity in the foulest of trades. Health hazards and hard knocks, injuries, disease, and rot, diving into the brutal realities behind the smelly veil. Working as a tanner or butcher was not just socially rough, it was physically punishing and often downright hazardous. The trades demanded long hours in grimy, wet, and dangerous environments where the risk of injury and illness was constant. Tanners wrestled with heavy hides soaked in unpredictable chemicals, ranging from the foul-smelling but necessary solutions of urine and lime to the natural but caustic tannins extracted from tree bark. Their hands were perpetually raw, cracked, and stained, a testament to their unyielding labor. The vats they worked with were slippery death traps. One wrong step could plunge a worker into a pool of noxious liquids, leading to infections or drowning. Butchers faced their own brutal challenges. Sharp knives and cleavers were their daily tools, but a moment's lapse in concentration could result in deep, sometimes fatal wounds. Slaughtering animals was a dangerous business. Livestock could panic and kick, and working close to massive carcasses invited crushing injuries. The blood and offal piled around them, fostering an environment ripe for bacteria and disease. Disease was a constant shadow. The stench and exposure to animal waste attracted flies and vermin, carriers of plague and other infections. Skin diseases like boils and ulcers were common, exacerbated by poor hygiene and limited medical knowledge. Respiratory issues also plagued workers exposed to dust, chemicals, and mold spores in enclosed tanning workshops. The work was also mentally taxing. The relentless smells and sights of death could wear down even the toughest spirits. Many workers lived shortened lives, their bodies battered and immune systems compromised. Despite this, the relentless demand for leather and meat meant the trades could not slow down or pause. In many ways, the tanners' and butchers' work symbolized the harshness of medieval life itself, grueling, unsanitized, and unforgiving. Yet these workers bore it all, fueling the gears of towns and cities with their sweat, skill, and sheer grit. Tanning villages, when whole communities stank together, the grand finale of stench and solidarity. Imagine entire villages where the smell of tanning was more than a nuisance. It was the defining characteristic of life. These tanning villages often sprang up on the outskirts of towns or along riverbanks, where the rivers could carry away the foul runoff and the smell wouldn't suffocate the town proper. In these communities, the air was thick with the pungent aroma of decomposing hides, fermenting urine, and chemical-rich tanning pits. Residents grew accustomed or resigned to the constant cloud of odors that clung to their clothes, skin, and homes. Outsiders often avoided these places altogether, associating them with filth, disease, and low social status. Tanning villages formed tight-knit groups bound by the hardships of their shared trade. Families often passed down tanning skills through generations to work both a livelihood and a family legacy. Children grew up playing among vats and drying hides, learning from an early age to endure the relentless smells and hard labor. Despite the challenges, these villages were more than just centers of stench. They were hubs of economic activity. The leather produced here fed into broader markets, supplying shoes, belts, saddles, and armor across regions. The villagers took pride in their craftsmanship, knowing their work was essential to medieval society, even if it was despised or ignored by many. Socially, tanning villages were often marginalized. Their inhabitants were seen as outsiders or pariahs, their presence tolerated but seldom embraced. Marriages outside the village were rare, and opportunities for upward mobility were limited. The stigma was both a badge of honor and a heavy burden. Yet in the face of ostracization and harsh working conditions, tanning villages endured for centuries, their persistence a testament to human resilience. They embodied the paradox of medieval life, a vital industry cloaked in grime, smell, and social exclusion. Leather empires, how tanning fueled global economies. Diving into how this smelly craft was a cornerstone of medieval and early modern global trade. Leather wasn't just a local craft. It was a key economic driver that connected far-flung corners of the world. From Europe to the Middle East, Africa to Asia, tanning supported vast empires and bustling trade networks. Cities like Venice, Cordoba, and Fez became famous for their leather industries, fueling both wealth and political power. Tanners produced everything from simple shoes to luxurious saddles and armor, goods that were in high demand from merchants, soldiers, and aristocrats alike. These products weren't confined to local markets. They traveled along caravan routes, riverways, and coastal ports, becoming prized commodities in distant lands. The value of leather extended beyond utility. Beautifully tanned and dyed hides became symbols of status and wealth. Nobles adorned themselves with leather boots and gloves, while merchants traded hides as valuable currency in their own right. Economic powerhouses built entire districts around tanning, creating jobs and wealth, but also environmental challenges. The craft's essential role in commerce ensured its survival and evolution through centuries, despite its notorious stench and difficult labor. Exporting the stench, how animal processing went industrial, where we explore how the dirty work of tanning and butchering scaled up and spread worldwide. As demand for leather and meat grew with expanding empires and bustling cities, tanning and animal processing shifted from small workshops to sprawling industrial operations. The once localized, smelly trades became global industries, with massive tanneries and slaughterhouses cropping up near ports and rivers to handle the influx of raw materials. This industrial scale meant bigger stink, too. Rivers near tanneries turned toxic with chemical runoff and animal waste, turning once clear waterways into foul, foamy nightmares. The smell of curing hides and slaughtered animals became a constant, choking presence in industrial cities, earning these areas notorious reputations. Ships loaded with salted hides, cured skins, and preserved meats plagued global trade routes. Places like London and Amsterdam, and later New York became hubs for exporting these goods to colonial markets and manufacturing centers. The industrialization also meant labor was more grueling and dangerous, with workers facing toxic chemicals, injuries, and disease. Yet the booming leather trade powered economies and even shaped urban development. Communities grew around these industries, united by the stench and skill that sustained them. From Cordoba to Timbuktu, global styles and specialties, a journey across continents and cultures through the diverse leather and meat traditions that define regions worldwide. Leather and meat processing were far from monolithic trades. Across the globe, distinct climates, cultures, and resources shaped unique styles and specialties that reflected local identity and ingenuity. In the bustling city of Cordoba during the medieval Islamic Golden Age, Artisans mastered intricate leatherwork, producing richly dyed, embossed, and tooled hides, prized for durability and artistry. Their techniques spread through trade networks, influencing craftsmanship from Spain to North Africa. Further south, Timbuktu stood as a hub of commerce and culture in the Sahara. Here, the tanning and preservation methods adapted to arid conditions, relying on sun-drying and salt curing to prepare hides and meats for long desert journeys. The trade in animal products connected sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean markets, blending nomadic and urban traditions. In Asia, supple leathers from China and India featured distinct tanning recipes using local tree barks, fruits, and herbs, often tied to cultural rituals and status symbols. Similarly, in Northern Europe, thick, durable hides suited the harsh climate, with tanning methods emphasizing water and cold. These regional differences weren't just practical, they were deeply woven into social fabric. From the clothes people wore to the tools they used and the rituals surrounding animal husbandry and slaughter, the global tapestry of tanning and butchery showcases humanity's ability to adapt and innovate even in the stinkiest of trades. Trade routes and animal products, salted meat and hide bales. Continuing our dive into the sprawling networks that move these pungent but precious goods across continents. Trade routes were the veins and arteries through which hides and salted meats flowed, connecting distant markets and feeding economies both local and global. Long before refrigerated trucks, merchants relied on ancient paths and coastal shipping lanes to move these perishable, odor-heavy commodities. Salted meat, cured with salt and smoke, was a vital provision for armies, sailors, and traders alike. It was rugged, portable, and durable enough to survive long journeys, sustaining people through harsh conditions. Ports along the Mediterranean, North Sea, and Indian Ocean bustled with ships laden with salted pork, beef, and fish, while caravan routes across deserts carried salted hides and dried meats to inland towns and cities. Hides were packed into bales, often soaked in brine to prevent decay, and loaded onto camel caravans or ox-drawn carts. These bales, heavy, smelly, and prized, traveled from rural tanneries to urban centers, then onto markets as far-flung as Venice, Cairo, or Constantinople. The risks were high. Theft, spoilage, and delays threatened profits and livelihoods. Yet, these trade networks thrived, fueling industries like saddlery, armor making, and clothing production, and underpinning social status symbols from nobles' leather boots to the commoner's durable work gear. Ultimately, the journey of salted meats and hides reveals a medieval world intricately connected through commerce, where even the foulest smelling goods could carry value beyond their odor. The finished product, soft leather, brutal labor, wrapping up our exploration of the journey from rawhide to supple leather and the harsh realities behind it. After days, sometimes weeks of soaking, scraping, and tanning, the once rigid, foul-smelling hides began their transformation into pliable, durable leather. This final product was the result of relentless, back-breaking labor that tested the endurance and skill of every craftsman in the tannery. The leatherworker's hands, rough and scarred, carefully smoothed and stretched each piece, removing imperfections and preparing it for its final use, be it sturdy boots, saddles, gloves, or armor. The scent of the tannery, a pungent blend of animal oils, tannins, and sweat, clung to these artisans like a second skin. Despite the value of their craft, tanners and leatherworkers were often marginalized by society, their stench and the nature of their work casting them as outcasts. Yet, their products were indispensable, woven into the fabric of daily life, travel, and warfare. The brutal labor behind leather production stood in sharp contrast to the finished goods' quiet elegance and utility. Each piece of leather carried a hidden story of toil, smell, and resilience, a testament to the human drive to turn the raw and revolting into the useful and enduring. Ritual slaughter and religious rules diving into the cultural and spiritual significance behind the meat and leather trades. In medieval societies, the act of slaughtering animals was far from a mere economic transaction. It was steeped in ritual and bound by strict religious codes. Whether for food, leather, or sacrifice, how and when an animal was killed carried heavy spiritual weight. Religious rules dictated which animals could be consumed or used, and how they had to be slaughtered. In Christian Europe, for example, certain feast days required specific types of meat, and butchers had to follow rituals to ensure the act was clean and acceptable to God. Jewish and Islamic communities followed their own strict kosher and halal laws, demanding precise methods of slaughter that honored divine commandments. Beyond religion, ritual slaughter was sometimes performed as an offering to gods or ancestors, with the smell of burning flesh and blood thick in the air, an olfactory tapestry woven into the fabric of cultural identity. These practices linked communities through shared beliefs and underscored the sacredness of life and death. Even in the grisly business of butchery, the sacrifices made on the butcher's block were both practical and profound, bridging the gap between survival and spirituality. This duality echoed through medieval life, where every cut of meat and piece of leather bore the imprint of belief and tradition. Leather and war, armor, saddles, and strategy, where the gritty trade of leather meets the brutal demands of medieval warfare. Leather was the unsung hero of the battlefield, strong and surprisingly versatile. While shining metal armor grabs the spotlight, leather provided essential protection and mobility for warriors across Europe and beyond. Leather armor, often layered and hardened, was worn by archers, cavalry, and foot soldiers who needed a balance between defense and agility. Unlike heavy plate, leather allowed for quieter movement and less fatigue during long marches or stealthy maneuvers. Saddles and tack crafted from leather transformed warfare by improving cavalry effectiveness. A sturdy leather saddle gave horsemen better control and endurance, crucial for charges and skirmishes that could turn the tide of battle. Bridles, reins, and armor plating for horses were all products of skilled tanning, made to endure harsh conditions and enemy strikes. Beyond protection, leather carried symbolic weight worn in crests, belts, and straps, adorned with badges of rank or allegiance. It wasn't just material. It was a statement of identity and martial prowess. Every piece of leather on the battlefield told a story of craftsmanship meeting necessity, bridging the gap between survival and strategy. The smoky smell of tanned hides mingled with the iron scent of blood, a stark reminder that leather was woven deep into the fabric of medieval conflict. Sacred, profane, or practical? How cultures viewed flesh. Diving into the complex, sometimes contradictory ways different societies treated meat and leather beyond mere utility. Across medieval cultures, the consumption and use of meat and leather were wrapped in layers of sacred meaning, superstition, and practical necessity. In some societies, certain animals were sacred, forbidden to eat or use, while in others, they were central to religious rituals or everyday life. For example, cows were revered in some cultures as symbols of fertility and prosperity, their hides used carefully and respectfully, while in others, beef was a staple of diet and leather a common product. Pigs, often associated with filth and impurity in religious texts, were simultaneously vital for food and leather goods, creating a moral and cultural tension. Ritual slaughter practices were meticulously observed to honor gods or maintain spiritual purity. Meat wasn't just nourishment, it was a bridge between the human and divine, a sacred gift requiring specific rites and taboos. Leather also carried symbolic weight. It could be seen as profane, associated with death and decay, especially since it was made from hides of dead animals. Yet, it was indispensable for daily life, craftsmanship, and even spiritual armor. Monks, knights, and peasants alike wore leather in different forms, each carrying distinct connotations. Feast days amplified these contrasts, where meat became a celebratory luxury surrounded by religious ceremony, and the smells of roasting flesh mingled with prayers and communal bonding. In short, flesh and leather lived at the intersection of the sacred and the profane, a reminder that even the grimiest trades were embedded in rich cultural tapestries of meaning. Feast days and sacrificial smells, exploring how the smells and rituals of meat and leather shaped communal life and religious observances. Feast days in medieval times were sensory spectacles where the scent of roasting meat filled the air, signaling celebration and abundance. These special occasions broke the monotony of everyday toil and provided moments of communal joy, though they came wrapped in complex layers of ritual and meaning. The preparation for feasts involved not just cooking, but ceremonial slaughter. Animals were often sacrificed according to religious customs, their meat shared among townsfolk as a symbol of divine blessing and social unity. The pungent aroma of blood, smoke, and spices mingled with prayers and chants, heightening the sense of sacred occasion. But it wasn't just the taste or sight of feasting that left an imprint. The smells themselves carried powerful associations. The sharp, metallic tang of blood or the rich, smoky scent of roasting flesh could evoke feelings of both reverence and raw, primal connection to life and death cycles. Leather, too, had its role. Hides were sometimes cured and prepared during these times. The earthy, tangy odor is a reminder of the material's journey from life to lasting utility. The crafting of leather goods often coincided with feasts, symbolizing renewal and the transformation of the raw into the refined. These olfactory experiences anchored communities in their traditions, marking the passage of seasons, the honoring of saints, or the sealing of alliances. The smells of sacrifice and celebration wove together the sacred and the everyday, linking body, spirit, and society in a tapestry of sensory memory. Refrigeration, railways, and the new meat economy, diving into how cold storage and railroads revolutionized the meat trade. As industrialization reshaped tanning, another technological leap revolutionized the meat industry: refrigeration. Before mechanical refrigeration, preserving meat meant salting, smoking, or drying, methods that limited freshness and quality. The invention and widespread adoption of refrigeration in the late 19th century transformed the meat trade entirely. Suddenly, fresh meat could be transported over vast distances without spoiling. And this was made possible by the expansion of railway networks crisscrossing continents. Refrigerated rail cars, reefers became arteries connecting rural slaughterhouses to booming urban centers hungry for fresh protein. This logistical miracle reshaped economies and diets. Meatpacking hubs like Chicago's Union Stockyards grew into industrial giants, processing thousands of animals daily. The old butcher shops and local slaughterhouses struggled to compete, as centralized industrial meat production provided cheaper, fresher products to a growing urban population. For tanners, this new scale of slaughter meant a flood of raw hides entering the market, but also heightened demand for consistency and standardization in leather goods. The transportation revolution linked producers and consumers in ways medieval craftsmen could never have imagined. Yet, this expansion came at a cost. The sheer scale of animal processing raised questions about animal welfare, worker conditions, and environmental impact concerns that would fuel public health reforms and regulatory movements in the decades to come. Public health and the cleanliness revolution, exploring how health concerns and reform reshaped meat and leather trades. The staggering growth of industrial meatpacking and tanning brought with it urgent public health challenges. In crowded urban centers, the pungent smells of slaughterhouses and tanneries mingled with rising fears about disease, contamination, and filth. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a sweeping cleanliness revolution, propelled by advances in microbiology and germ theory. Visionary reformers and scientists exposed unsanitary practices in meatpacking plants, most famously through Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, which shocked the public with vivid depictions of rotten meat, contaminated products, and harsh working conditions. Governments responded with landmark legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in the United States. For instance, mandating stricter sanitation standards and inspections. Tanning operations, long notorious for pollution and toxic waste, also came under scrutiny, prompting regulations to limit environmental damage and protect workers from hazardous chemicals. These reforms transformed the image of meat and leather trades from back alley nuisances to modern regulated industries. Cleaner methods, improved ventilation, and better waste management became standard. Yet, the scars of centuries of grime and danger lingered in cultural memory and folklore. In essence, the public health movement was more than a set of rules. It was a pivotal turning point that paved the way for safer food, healthier communities, and environmentally conscious industries. Leather was synthetic. From cow to chemistry, the story of how leather's ancient craft met modern science. As the 20th century marched forward, the age-old art of tanning faced a new challenge and opportunity in the form of synthetic materials. The rise of plastics, artificial fibers, and chemical substitutes began to change the way people thought about leather. Synthetic leather, often called pleather, offered a cheaper, more uniform alternative to traditional hides. For industries hungry for mass production and cost savings, these new materials were irresistible. They could be manufactured without the odors, mess, or ethical concerns that plagued animal-based leather production. Yet, this shift was more than just economics. It was a cultural transformation. Leather, once a symbol of craftsmanship, durability, and natural beauty, started to compete with shiny, man-made surfaces. Factories that had once buzzed with scraping knives and soaking vats adapted or closed as chemical engineers took over. Despite this, real leather held onto its prestige, especially in fashion, luxury goods, and certain durable goods like saddles and boots. But the market increasingly split into two worlds, one of natural hides steeped in tradition, and another of synthetic innovation aimed at mass consumption. This transition raised questions about sustainability, environmental impact, and animal rights that continue to shape debates today. While the chemical revolution changed the industry forever, it also rekindled appreciation for the old crafts and pushed artisans to innovate in preserving their heritage. Museums of the macabre, how these trades are remembered, bringing us full circle with a soft, reflective close. Today, the old tanning pits are mostly quiet. The butcher's hooks that once swung over dirt floors now hang behind glass. And the smells, those unforgettable perfumes of blood, brine, and lime exist only in memory. Yet in small towns and industrial corners across the globe, the story of these trades lingers. If you know where to look, you might find it in an open-air museum where a reconstructed tannery sits beside a blacksmith's forge. Tour guides gesture toward wooden vats, explaining how villagers once stirred cowhides with paddles, and children wrinkle their noses in mild horror. Old ledgers with curled edges and iron clasps list deliveries of hides and barrels of tannin. A rusted scraper lies beside them, its handle worn smooth. There are museums that preserve entire slaughterhouses, blood chutes intact, offering a sterile, silent glimpse into what was once a cacophony of noise and death. Wax figures of aproned men wield cleavers in frozen scenes, while looped audio narrates the steps from hoof to hook. Its history made digestible, palatable, even softened for modern sensibilities. Elsewhere, in less formal settings, the legacy is etched into language and lore. The term getting tanned persists in idioms. Old neighborhoods are still nicknamed the Butcher's Row, long after the shops themselves vanished. And tucked into drawers or hanging from attic rafters, some families still keep heirloom leather goods. A belt, a saddle, a pair of gloves, cracked but intact, reminders of the lives built with skill and stink. Perhaps the strangest shift is this: what was once avoided and ignored, those dirty, smelly traits have become subjects of fascination. Podcast episodes wax poetic about pre-industrial labor. Documentaries highlight lost arts. Artists reinterpret tanning and butchery in gallery spaces. And reenactors scrape hides by hand, explaining each step to sleepy crowds at heritage fairs. The macabre has mellowed with time. We no longer need to tan or butcher to survive, but understanding those who did grounds us in something older than industry, older than progress. It grounds us in the shared grid of history. What the trades teach us: stink, sweat, and survival, the invisible foundations of civilization. When we imagine the forces that built civilization, our minds tend to leap to monuments and manifestos. to kings and conquerors, to scribes in temples and scholars in towers. But beneath those lofty visions lies quieter, grimier truth. Civilization was also built by people knee-deep in filth, elbow-deep in carcasses and nose-blind from years of exposure to smells no poet ever bothered to immortalize. For all the great ideas and grand ideals of human progress, it was the tanner and the butcher who helped make daily life possible. These were the tradespeople who never appeared in the annals of courtly chronicles, yet whose labor touched nearly every aspect of the material world. From the leather binding on holy books to the cured meat that fed armies and cities, the work of tanners and butchers was elemental. They processed life's leftovers, bone, skin, blood, and offal, and turned them into utility. They stitched together the raw, pungent seams of daily survival. If you were to walk through a pre-industrial town, the most vital infrastructures were not just walls and roads, but the complex, invisible systems of food and material production. Leather was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Shoes, belts, saddles, bags, gloves, armor, tents, harnesses, bellows, buckets, books, and binding cords. Each required processed hide. Without the tanner, the world's gears quite literally would not turn. Likewise, butchers did more than provide Sunday roasts. They supplied essential fats for candles and soaps, bones for tools and glues, and hides to pass along to tanners. Their work was visceral and violent, but also logistical. Before refrigeration, meat had to be processed quickly, preserved with care, and distributed intelligently. A town's food security often depended not on abundance, but on butchering skill and speed. These workers didn't merely occupy the margins of society, they reinforced its foundations. They were economic linchpins, not expendable labor. A failed tannery meant a shortage of harnesses and leather goods. A sick butcher meant festering carcasses and food insecurity. Despite this, the trades remained largely uncelebrated. They were dirty. They smelled. They offended genteel sensibilities. Their labor was necessary but hidden, crucial but undignified in the social imagination. Over time, these foundational trades became even more invisible. As cities grew and technologies advanced, the messy parts of production were pushed to the outskirts geographically, socially, and ideologically. The cleaner the civilization appeared, the more it leaned on the filth kept out of sight. Leather still covered our furniture and adorned our feet. Meat still filled our plates. But few paused to think about where those things came from or who made them possible. Today, as we marvel at clean streets and spotless supermarket aisles, it's easy to forget that civilization is still built on those same basic needs. We just don't see the people who meet them. Yet the legacy of tanners and butchers lingers in our infrastructure, our language, and even our laws. Their trades formed the bedrock upon which cities could rise and societies could stabilize. Without them, the elegant edifices of civilization would be built on sand. So, when we say the invisible foundations of civilization, we're not speaking in metaphor. We're speaking of salt-rubbed hides stretched over wooden frames, of steam rising from slaughterhouse floors, of aprons stiff with grease and boots caked in blood and bark. We're speaking of the real, raw labor that allowed humanity to clothe, feed, and arm itself into something resembling order. It may not be pretty, but it is, undeniably, history. Dirty work, honest work. Changing views on labor. For centuries, the tanning pits and slaughter sheds occupied not just the physical margins of society, but the moral and philosophical ones as well. Those who waded knee-deep in blood or stirred vats of putrid hides were often shunned, both socially and spiritually. Yet the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The trades that once defined dirty work were not merely tolerated, they were essential. And the laborers who toiled in stench and sweat weren't failures or deviants. They were the backbone of civilization, misrecognized for generations. In many pre-industrial towns, the distinction between clean and unclean labor was more than just about physical filth. It was a hierarchy of dignity. Clerics and merchants might boast soft hands and soap-scented robes. But they relied on the butcher's knife and the tanner's paddle to provide the goods they could not live without. Society was deeply interwoven with these trades, even as it held its nose. This cognitive dissonance, this simultaneous dependence and disgust, shaped how people viewed manual labor. What's fascinating is how these views began to shift. Industrialization played a part, yes, but so did moral philosophy, labor activism, and cultural reevaluation. By the 19th century, thinkers like John Ruskin and William Morris were reasserting the value of manual craftsmanship. Even as machines were replacing human hands, they romanticized the pre-industrial trades, not because they loved the stink of blood and lime, but because they saw authenticity in work that was grounded in necessity, creation, and physical effort. They weren't alone. In the United States, the work ethic of the early 20th century began to praise the very types of labor once marginalized. The Depression and 2 world wars reinforced the nobility of getting one's hands dirty. Soldiers needed boots, real leather ones. They needed salted meat. Cannery workers and meat packers were no longer merely outcasts. They were contributors to the national good. The grimy trades were not abolished, they were industrialized, institutionalized, and in some ways reimagined as patriotic. Still, the old stigma hasn't entirely vanished. We may respect the idea of hard work, but we often still reserve the highest praise for those far removed from it. The butcher, the tanner, the meat packer, and the factory line worker continue to labor out of sight and frequently out of mind. We've traded in our open markets for sterile supermarkets, our handmade belts for cheap synthetic straps, and with those substitutions, some sense of connection has faded. But there are signs of a slow reawakening. Farmers markets, slow fashion, and ethically sourced leather goods represent a quiet rebellion against the anonymization of labor. Documentaries, museums, and artisan collectives are pulling back the curtain. They remind us that what was once hidden and reviled deserves a second look, not just for its economic value, but for what it reveals about resilience, necessity, and the unpolished truth of survival. Dirty work has always been honest work. It was never less than vital. And perhaps now, in a world that grows ever cleaner on the surface, we're beginning to see the worth of what was once wiped away. The ethics of meat and material in the modern world. The modern age is full of moral reckonings. Climate change, animal welfare, sustainability. These aren't niche debates anymore. They're mainstream and they're unavoidable. And nowhere do they come into sharper focus than when we take a long, slow look at how we get 2 things: meat and leather. The trades we've been exploring, tanning and butchery, may feel like medieval relics, but their ethical shadows stretch all the way to our dinner plates and closet shelves. Let's start with the obvious. Modern meat production is a behemoth. Unlike the village butcher who might have slaughtered a single cow for the community, today's meat industry moves at a scale that would have baffled and maybe horrified our ancestors. Massive feedlots, mechanized slaughterhouses, and global supply chains have turned livestock into commodities. Animals are bred not just for consumption, but for optimization, faster growth, leaner cuts, more uniform carcasses. And the result? Cheaper meat, yes, but also ethical blind spots big enough to drive a refrigerated truck through. When we consider the butchers of the past, those who knew the animals they killed, who worked with their hands and took pride in a clean, respectful kill, we start to see an ethical contrast. The old methods were brutal, no doubt, but they were transparent. There was no illusion about where the meat came from or what it took to get it. Today, by contrast, the average consumer is blissfully insulated from the processes behind their burgers. Out of sight, out of mind, until perhaps a documentary drops or a scandal hits the headlines. Leather is no different. Tanning in the past was disgusting, but paradoxically honest. Animal hides were a byproduct of meat. Waste was minimized. A cow wasn't slaughtered for fashion. It was eaten, and its hide became boots. The old tanners weren't perfect environmentalists, but they weren't industrial polluters either. Today, however, much of the world's leather comes from massive tanneries in countries where environmental regulations are lax or unenforced. Rivers run black with chemical runoff. Workers are exposed to chromium salts without protective gear. The trade has grown, but at what cost? This raises a deeper question. Can we use animals for food and materials ethically? Some say no, full stop. Veganism, vegetarianism, synthetic leathers, and lab-grown meats all represent efforts to detach from the cycle of slaughter and environmental harm. Others say the answer is yes, but only with a massive overhaul. Better animal welfare standards, transparency in sourcing, local, small-scale production, an end to wasteful practices. In short, a return to something more like the old butcher or the traditional tanner. Not nostalgic fantasy, but thoughtful rebalancing. Even the language we use is revealing. Artisan, heritage, ethically raised, pasture-fed, vegetable tanned. These phrases attempt to signal moral purity in a murky world. They hint at a longing to reconnect with the values we've lost. Accountability, craftsmanship, restraint. But they also raise concerns about class and access. Ethical leather boots or grass-fed steaks often cost triple what industrial versions do. Who gets to feel morally upright and who's just trying to afford dinner? The dirty trades teach us that production always has a cost. It may be labor, it may be environmental, it may be ethical. But nothing is free, not truly. And when we forget that, when we obscure the process behind a plastic-wrapped steak or a shiny leather handbag, we don't just lose sight of the animal. We lose sight of ourselves. The lesson here isn't to vilify meat or leather. It's to remember what it means to take from the earth and from living creatures. It's to ask not just what we're buying, but what we're supporting. The past can't give us all the answers, but it can remind us that ethical consumption isn't about perfection. It's about awareness, about intention, about seeing the blood and the bark tannin for what they are, messy, human parts of a much bigger story. Romanticizing the gross. Ooh, why we're fascinated. There's something strangely magnetic about the grotesque. In a modern world, scrub it sterile by antibacterial wipes and air fresheners. The repulsive realities of past foul-smelling tanneries, blood-slicked butcher blocks, steaming vats of entrails, seem to draw us in, not drive us away. The question is, why? What is it about these grimy trades, with all their filth and flesh, that we find so compelling, so weirdly beautiful from a distance? Part of it lies in contrast. These were not hidden occupations in their own time, they were simply life. Meat didn't appear on grocery shelves wrapped in plastic. Leather didn't come pre-cut into handbags or belts. People lived with the origin stories of these materials. They smelled them, stepped over the byproducts in the street, wore the leather with the knowledge of how it got supple. Today, most of us live at a safe remove. And so, what once was mundane now feels exotic. Historical fiction, living museums, and artisanal revivals often romanticize these trades. A blacksmith's forge, a butcher's cleaver, a rack of hides drying in the sun. These are offered as symbols of authenticity, a gritty antidote to the clean digital world we inhabit. But make no mistake, the romance is highly curated. In sanitized reenactments, the tanning pits don't stink of dog dung, and nobody sprains a wrist scraping brains off hides. We admire the calluses, but not the infections. There's also a kind of nostalgia involved, a yearning for a time when work was tangible and materials spoke of origin. Leather today might come from a hydroponic lab or a vat of synthetic fibers, but we still cling to the iconography of hand-stitched saddles and weathered aprons. These old trades represent, in the public imagination, a certain muscular honesty. They offer a fantasy of control, of shaping raw nature into form, when in fact, much of the historical experience was chaotic, unhygienic, and exploitative. In film and television, butcher shops are often depicted with a grotesque beauty. Glistening carcasses hanging on hooks, steam rising from pots of rendered fat, blades flashing in the low light. It's not quite horror, not quite history. It lives in the uncanny space between awe and revulsion, where curiosity thrives. Tanners, too, are rendered with a sort of dark reverence. Covered in grime, reeking of lye and decay, they are alchemists of the abhorrent turning death into durability. Anthropologists have long noted that the sacred and the disgusting often occupy the same symbolic real estate. Things that are taboo are also powerful. Blood, guts, flesh, and decay are not just dirty. They are liminal. They remind us of mortality, of transformation, of what separates the living from the dead and the natural from the refined. The trades of tanning and butchery operated on this line, crafting utility from the very things society might otherwise reject. Even language gives away our twisted affection. We speak of someone being tough as old leather, or bringing home the bacon, with a wink to their survivalist prowess. A meat and potatoes kind of person is straightforward and dependable, not squeamish or soft. These expressions root us in a cultural past where contact with the visceral was normal, even admirable. And so, we romanticize. We build museum exhibits about stinking canneries. We buy artisanal leather wallets embossed with logos of 19th century tools. We take Instagram photos of dry-aged meat like it's high art. We want the symbolism without the smell. But perhaps that, too, is part of the historical loop. Just as medieval citizens might have viewed the smithy with both respect and a wrinkled nose, or the butcher's stall with equal parts hunger and unease, we too are drawn to the edge where useful becomes unpleasant, where work meets waste, where the human story, in all its sensory messiness, refuses to be bleached out. In the end, the fascination is not with the filth itself, but with the transformation it represents. The story of how we took the raw, the smelly, the dead, and made from it something to carry, to wear, to eat. Something to build a civilization on, no matter how badly it reeked. A final reflection. History beneath our feet and skin. When the last tannery chimney cooled, and the final butcher's block was scrubbed clean, what remained was more than the physical silence of trades now vanished. What remained was a deep imprint, not only on our culture or our clothing, but on our very sense of what it means to live in a world made by hands, by blood, by callus and cut and craft. To walk the cobbled paths of an old European town, or follow the sun-cracked dirt trails where hides once hung to dry, is to walk over buried labor. 1,000 unmarked footprints left by workers whose names were rarely written down. We may no longer smell the acrid tang of lime pits or hear the rhythmic thud of cleavers in a communal slaughterhouse, but their echoes shape our cities, our vocabularies, and our unspoken ideas about labor, worth, and what must be hidden in order to maintain comfort. Leather still wraps our feet, our furniture, and our imagined pasts. Even synthetic imitation calls back to the real thing, to the flesh and fiber that made the original. Meat still commands the center of many tables, ritual and casual alike, even as new ethics challenge us to look harder at how it got there. We are always touching history, even when it's been sanitized, repackaged, and placed behind glass or beneath polished shoes. And what are the people who work the trade? What do they tell us through silence and artifact? They tell us that survival was not tidy. That civilization was not built by the polished or perfumed, but by those who lived in the thick of life's unavoidable mess. They remind us that every clean plate once passed through filth, and every fine leather-bound volume once began with the knife. They stand behind us, unseen yet wholly present, in the idioms we speak, the tools we take for granted, the invisibly soft solace we walk on daily. Even now, the old smells have not completely faded. Some linger in old barns and antique shops. Some rise faintly from well-worn gloves or vintage jackets. And some remain only in metaphor in the way we talk about grit, about getting our hands dirty, about the noble stink of real work. In remembering these trades, in tracing their rough outlines through history, we are not merely cataloging obsolete professions. We are reminding ourselves what we are made of. Not just bone and skin, but story and struggle. We are animals that became artisans, who fashion shelter and sustenance out of the refuse of life, and in doing so, define culture. So the next time you slip on a belt, carve a Sunday roast, or stroll past a disused stone building with iron hooks set into the wall, spare thought for the tanner and the butcher, for the stink and the sweat that built the world, and for the quiet, enduring truth that beneath our feet, and even beneath our skin, history is never far away. Beneath the stink, a human story. The trades of tanning and butchery are not the kind of histories we usually place in glass cases or carve into marble. They are not bathed in glory, or often even mentioned in polite conversation. They do not wear silk or speak Latin. They stink. And yet, they tell a more honest story of civilization than many of the polished tailies that crowd our bookshelves. They tell of hands, blistered and calloused, shaping the very stuff of survival. Of men and women rising before dawn, navigating blood and rot with practiced calm. Of neighborhoods thick with the smell of dung and smoke, not because people were ignorant or filthy, but because this was the necessary price of living close to what sustained them. In tanning yards and butcher stalls, we find the missing half of progress. We see the labor that made comfort possible. The labor that modernity often erases, but never truly escapes. Even now, in our sanitized world of prepackaged meat and synthetic shoes, echoes of these old trades persist. The rituals remain, if not the rawness. A holiday roast still brings families together in ways not so different from the medieval slaughter feasts. A fine leather wallet still carries prestige, even as we flinch from the process that made it. But it is worth remembering that these comforts come from somewhere, that they are born of work. Messy, skilled, uncelebrated work. And that the people who performed it, often poor, sometimes despised, were architects of the world we inherited. They are not just relics. They are reminders. Reminders that the path from field to feast, from skin to satchel, has always passed through hands willing to get dirty. Reminders that civilization is not just aqueducts and cathedrals and courtly poems. It is also scraping hides in freezing rain. It is swinging a cleaver while flies buzz thick in the air. It is work that fed, clothed, and grounded entire societies. And perhaps by drawing close to these forgotten trades, we draw a little closer to our own reality. The one not built on illusion, but on the slow, smelly truth of survival. So let us give the last word not to kings or clerics, but to the tanner and the butcher, whose worlds may reek to heaven, but whose work brought the earth a little closer to home.